Great, thank you very much, and thank you all for coming this morning through the drizzle, or mizzle as we call it, where I come from in the West Country, which I think nicely captures the sort of miserable, misty drizzle that we're experiencing this morning. So, well, thank you for coming and finding shelter in here with me for the next hour or so. I first lectured in this lecture block in 1998, so nearly 30 years ago, which is not quite living forever, but still going strong. My name's Stephen Caven. I'm the co-director of the Institute for Technology and Humanity, which is very new. We launched just 2 years ago, and we're a new department-like thing in the School of Arts and Humanities, where we bring together people from a wide range of disciplines. I'm a philosopher by training, but we have technologists and social scientists and historians and design engineers and all sorts come together with the mission of making technological transformation go as well as possible for humanity. We have 3 research centres in our institute: the Centre for the Study of Existential Risk, where they try to stop the collapse of civilization. So far, so good-ish. The vast majority of civilizations in history have collapsed, so it's something that we need to take seriously. Then there's the Centre for Human-Inspired AI. They're the optimists, the glass-half-full people who are building AI for good. And then there's the Leverhulme Centre for the Future of Intelligence, which I also run, where we think about the ethics and impact of AI and related technologies. So I divide my time between thinking about the ethics and impact of AI and robotics and so on, and the ethics and impact of life extension technologies, which is what we're going to talk about today. So, first, a survey. Who here wants to live forever? And that was the question of our talk. Who wants to live forever? Who wants to live forever? Who wants to live forever? Hands up. There we go. Yes, definitely some who seem quite sure, but also a minority. Okay, I mean, that's usually the case. Some who are gung-ho, optimistic about keeping going for billions and billions of years, and others who are a bit more nervous. So, infinity is a long time. Okay, who would like to be in control of how long they live? Hands up. See, a much higher number, although still interestingly not everyone, but I would say over half. Okay, so before we start talking about much longer lives, I want to get a sense of the baseline of where we're at. So, here we go. No one needs that on a Sunday morning, do they? Right. Think of the year you were born. You don't have to tell me. I'm not going to go round. So it was 1973 for me. I want you to now add 80 to that. So you have to get your brains working. Sunday morning, I know. Get your brains working, add 80. So for me, that's 2053. If you're a woman, you can add 2 to that. If you're a man, take 2 off. So that puts me on 2051. If you do regular exercise, by which I mean more than 4 times per week, then you can add a number 5 to that. You still with me? Yeah, good. So I'm on 2056. If you smoke cigarettes, take 10 off. Right, I don't, so I'm on 2056. Well, as I'm sure you've guessed, you're working out the year you are due to die. Statistically speaking, of course, it's only a rough guess. I'm not going to come round and enforce it in any way. Some of you will look after yourselves better than others. Some of you might be aware of some, genetic factor that either induces you to live longer, have very long-lived parents or grandparents, or some disease or some such. You'll have noticed some of you might have a year in the past. So, well done. Treat every day as a blessing is my advice. So are there any 90-year-old smokers in the audience? Yeah, there usually aren't. There's a reason for that. But anyway, but don't. If the date you've got is next month, then don't despair, because what I haven't taken into account is the fact that the longer you live, the more sort of bonus time you get. Because the figures I'm using, average life expectancy around 80 and so on, is average life expectancy at birth. And for every year you survive, your life expectancy goes up because you successfully not died at that younger age. So if you are an 80-year-old male then yes, you've exceeded your life expectancy at birth, but your life expectancy now will, of course, be at some point in the future. So it's not as gloomy as you might have first thought. Still, my date of 2056 feels uncomfortably close to me. Time flies, right? So it was like the 80s just a minute ago. So it won't be long till 2056. But on the other hand, the fact that this is called period life expectancy, which is life expectancy of all ages at a given moment in time, which is currently 80, around 80 in the UK. The fact that period life expectancy is 80 in most developed countries is an astonishing achievement. As I'm sure you know, for most of human history, life expectancy was in the 30s. So it wasn't in this country until 200 years ago, around 1810, that it crept above 40. 100 years ago, it was into the 50s with a blip for the Great War. But for the vast majority of human history, it was in the 30s, and that's been pretty consistent. So the fact that life expectancy has more than doubled in just 200 years is really an extraordinary revolution that we ought to be celebrating. So instead of me complaining about 2056 seeming too soon, we ought to be grateful. I ought to be grateful. But still, we dream of more. And indeed, there are optimists today who say that, well, if we've doubled life expectancy once, then surely we can double life expectancy again. And then maybe again and again. We can master aging and disease, the mechanics of our body. As those of you who said you wanted to live forever, or just said you wanted to be able to control how you age, how long you live, when you die, there are optimists today who think that will be possible. Well, are they right? That's what I'm going to talk about today, the prospects for a significant breakthrough in life extension. I'm first going to give you the case against, the glass half empty case, and then I'll give you the case for, and then I'll tell you what I think it all means. So, okay, I'm going to give you two arguments against the idea that we're on the verge of a significant breakthrough in life extension. So the first one, right, some of you might know this, but it's worth unpacking a little bit. I've said that life expectancy in the developed world has more than doubled in the last couple hundred years. And the optimists say, well, if we've done it once, we can do it again. Is that true? Well, so a host of discoveries, as I'm sure you know, have enabled that doubling in life expectancy. One of the most important was understanding that infectious diseases are caused by microbes, which led to the development of vaccines, huge public sanitation enterprises, clearing up of the open sewers, doctors washing their hands in between appointments, and so on. And then in 1928, the discovery of the first antibiotic, penicillin. Infectious diseases like whooping cough, measles, diphtheria, and scarlet fever together accounted for 34,000 deaths in England in 1901 and 0 in 2001. Now, this did reduce the risk of dying at all ages, but it very significantly reduced the risk of dying in childhood. So, although these kind of diseases and infections can and did impact everyone, they very disproportionately impacted children and infants. So as you probably know, child mortality for all of human history was, until just very recently, extremely high. Here in England, 200 years ago, 3 in 10 children would die before their 5th year. Another one would die before the age of 15. Perhaps another 1 out of 10 would die in early adulthood. The risk of infection is still high, but also women are starting to produce children. Risk of death in childbirth was high. It's when men go off to do silly things like fight wars and whatnot, and so on. Now think of what all of those early deaths are doing for the averages. So if we're saying life expectancy is in the 30s, but if half of people are dying, before 20 and 30% before the age of 5, then how long is everybody else living in order to create an average of 30 or 40? Well, the answer is into their 60s or 70s or 80s. So an average life expectancy of between 30 and 40 does not mean everyone is, dropping dead in their prime. So let me give you an example. I made these numbers up, but they are reflective and imaginary family from 200 years ago in this country, ages at death. So, 6 months, 1.5, and so on. So we've got our 3 and 10 dying in infancy. We have another one dying in childhood. This is what the statistics say for 1800. Another one dying in, a couple dying in early adulthood. Again, it could be childbirth, it could be war or accident or indeed infectious disease still, of course. One in middle age, and then we've got 3 living into their 70s. And you might think, well, how plausible is it that in these dangerous times people are living into their 70s? Well, recall what it says in the Bible, in the Psalm 90. The days of our years are 70 years and 10, that's 70. And it goes on, and if by reason of strength they be 80 years, that's 80, yet is their strength labour and sorrow. That is, it's saying in the Bible, in the Old Testament, written, 2,500 years ago, that a natural human lifespan is 70 to 80 years. Now, if you look at the averages, well, as I'm sure you know, remember from your maths GCSEs or O-levels, there are different kinds of average. The mean of these numbers, that is, you add them all up and divide them by 10, is 32, which is a typical life expectancy for most of human history. But the mode, which is the most frequently occurring number, is 70. So what I want to convey is that even though life expectancy for most of human history was very low, that is in the 30s, nonetheless there was a clear conception of a natural human lifespan that was actually 70 plus. And the tragedy was not enough people were reaching it because of infection, because of death in childbirth, because of war and other violence and so on. So doubling life expectancy in the way that we've seen over the last 200 years meant tackling all of these early deaths. As we said, it meant tackling, the kind of infectious diseases and so on, and also just making, health and safety, making the world a much safer place. So people aren't dying anything like in the same numbers at these very early ages. So what that means is many more people are able to live what we might call a natural human lifespan. And what this means is when doubling life expectancy over the last 200 years has been adding years to the lives of infants. And if you want to do that, nature is on your side. If you want to double life expectancy again from 80 to 160, nature is definitely not on your side. Because all of the evidence suggests that there is something like a natural human life course and there is significant deterioration from the age of 50 onwards, and it becomes exponential after beyond 75 or so. And aging is enormously complex. As I'm sure you know, it isn't just one gene that can be turned on or off. The diseases that kill people in developed countries like this one, like cancer and heart disease and stroke and so on, are all linked in ways to aging itself, to deterioration. And all of the systems of the body begin to fail around this time. So one demographer estimated that if we were able to cure all forms of cancer, people would on average live only 3 years longer because all of their systems are failing at this time. If we cured all of the big killers, cancer, heart disease, stroke, people would only live, according to one demographer anyway, only 15 years longer because all of these systems are failing at this time. So this is my first argument for the glass half empty. It's the idea that we have something like a new natural human lifespan. We've doubled life expectancy once by allowing more people to live that out. And it would be a radically different kind of challenge to double life expectancy again, one that would require a complete transformation of what we are as organisms. Right, that's argument one. Argument two. We're on the verge of a breakthrough in life extension. We've been standing on this verge for about 5,000 years, which is really bad for my arthritis. We've heard it all before. People have been dreaming of an elixir of life or a fountain of youth or something like that for all of recorded history. You can find these things in every civilization that has been chronicled. And, they thought they had good reasons too, right? 2,000 years ago, in China, there was enormous interest in elixir of life. And they thought, well, look at this fantastic civilization we've built. Look at everything we've achieved. Surely the elixir of life is just one more small step down this long road of civilization. And the ancient Egyptians believed exactly the same thing 2,000 years before that. Mummification was very much plan B. There were elaborate papyruses detailing their rejuvenation mechanisms and so on. So this is the first emperor of China. He unified the warring kingdoms of China, brought an end to the warring states period that had lasted many hundreds of years. This is around 220 BC. And he was completely obsessed with immortality. He would execute anyone who mentioned the word death in his presence. He would have poems to immortality sung wherever he went. He was paranoid about assassination and so on. And he was completely obsessed with creating an elixir of life. And he commissioned the very best, alchemists and wizards and physicians and so on to create him one. But sadly, he died at the age of 49. It's my phenomenal PowerPoint skills. So he was poisoned, but not by the assassin whom he dreaded. But from contemporary sources, we have a very good idea of the ingredients that would have been in his elixir, which would have included gold, jade, mercury, sulfur, lead, orpiment. His elixir would at the very least have led to mercury, lead and arsenic poisoning, and possibly all three. In other words, his elixir killed him. Well, okay, you might think that this time it's different. We've got modern science and technology. But, of course, modern science and technology has produced many wonders which we enjoy today. But there is no strict dividing line between the achievements of Chinese civilization 2,000 years ago and the achievements of, Western civilization today. And that the distinction between science and technology on the one hand and myth and magic on the other is still not at all as distinct as we would like to think it is. So science and technology, modern science and technology, is absolutely rife with examples of people claiming to have discovered an elixir of life, people who believed they were on the verge of a breakthrough. A century ago, one very famous professor made a fortune sewing slices of monkey testicles onto millionaires with the promise it would turn back the clock. Another one, Eugene Steinack, became rich and famous by promising a new rejuvenation treatment. Sigmund Freud undertook it, W.B. Yeats undertook it, the entire team of Wolverhampton Wanderers undertook it. Today we call it a vasectomy, and it has no impact. Within the lifetimes of some of us, the double Nobel Prize winner Linus Pauling campaigned for vitamin C as an elixir of life that could stop cancer and so on. And what all of these believers have in common, yes, they're all pushing up daisies. They're all dead. So surely we would be foolish to think it's any different this time. That's the second argument. We've heard it all before. So to sum up the case against, on the one hand, doubling life expectancy the first time, nature was on our side and giving years to the lives of babies. It would be completely different to do it again. And the second argument is all of these claims to be on the verge of a breakthrough we have heard before. All right, why should we think it's different this time? Well, that is what I'm going to come to now. Why should we think it's different this time? I'm going to give you two reasons again. So, first of all, I've just mentioned that doubling life expectancy doubled it to something like a natural human lifespan. But what I now want to argue is that we are already starting to push the boundaries of the natural human lifespan. So there are a number of pieces of evidence for this. The first is that although it's true that the Bible talks about, a life of 70 years and 10 or even 70 years, so 70 to 80, and in other cultures too, in Hinduism, for example, there are, distinct life stages. And the last one, the renouncer, starts at 75. Okay, so there's widespread evidence of this natural human lifespan. Still, optimists would argue that we are starting to push those bounds. So we saw most of the benefits of tackling childhood mortality and so on from about 1750 in this country to 1950. And from then on, people were living until their 70s, but we have continued to push life expectancy up. So if you think 70 to 80 is the natural human lifespan, well, now life expectancy in many developed countries is 81. In some, it's even 82. And that's an average, which means many people are living into their 90s, and we have an increasing number of centenarians. And that is so-called period life expectancy, which takes the rate of death at any given time and extrapolates it. Cohort life expectancy, which also extrapolates improvements in life expectancy, is even more optimistic and says that children born today can expect to live into their 90s. Well, that's not what the Bible talks about, right? Sorry, I've just tipped my water everywhere. I'm going to ignore that. So if you could too, we'll all be fine. I can still just about read my notes. I knew what I was going to say anyway. Anyway, yeah, so we are starting to push life expectancy up beyond the natural human lifespan already. And as I say, there are blips, like COVID, of course, was a blip. In America, there are so-called deaths of despair around opioid addiction and gun violence and so on. But underneath those figures, there seems to be a consistent progress in managing the traditional killers. So, perhaps some of you here today, or I'm sure people you know, will have had some of those traditional killers of heart disease and cancer, strokes and dementia and so on, and be managing those. That's what modern medicine is enabling us to do. My stepfather has had 10 instances of cancer of 4 different kinds, and he's still on his feet and enjoying life. So we really are seeing genuine progress in managing this end-of-life period and extending life beyond what we might think of as a natural human lifespan. And the second piece of evidence I want to give is that with sort of so-called model organisms, that is other species in the lab, we've been able to extend, I haven't done it, but some people, including in this university, have been able to extend the lifespans of organisms very significantly. So in simple organisms like nematode worms, tenfold. And in complex organisms like our fellow mammals, by around 30%. So with mice, for example, dogs and monkeys. So this is really huge. This shows that we really are understanding the mechanisms of aging much better. And of course we've had phenomenal breakthroughs. It isn't illusory that we've made progress in our understanding of physiology. Think of the breakthroughs in this university alone, the unraveling of DNA and so on. We really do understand the underlying mechanisms of aging and disease much better before, and how to intervene in them. And there is evidence for this. So, if I look at my soggy notes, that's argument number 1. Argument number 2, all of this progress is making a huge difference to the respectability of the field of gerontology. Now, because of all of the cranks that I mentioned in the 20th century, or Linus Pauling, as I say, double Nobel Prize winner, a hugely important figure in a whole range of disciplines, but by the end of his life was described by Nature as a lonely old crank. So this interest in life extension was associated with cranks, with, snake oil, with charlatanry. But this real progress that's been happening since the 90s, understanding the underlying genetic mechanisms of aging, for example, proof of concepts in the lab, is making gerontology, the study of aging and anti-aging, respectable again. And that means huge amounts of money and talent and resource are now going into the field. It helps also that, the baby boomer generation who, are used to having it all and want to having it all are now facing the reaper, and they want something to happen. Am I speaking to anyone out here who's... and they include some very, very wealthy people, right? And some of the richest people on the planet, billionaires, centi-billionaires. It's like people with hundreds of billions. People like Larry Ellison, the founder of Oracle, Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, Larry Page, one of the co-founders of Google, are putting their money into life extension research. Jeff Bezos, the founder of Amazon, is one of the founders of Altos Labs, which has a base in California, which has a very long history of belief in, we're on the threshold of rejuvenation. Evelyn Waugh wrote a satire of belief in this 100 years ago. The land of optimists. There's one lab based in California, but there's one lab here in the land of Mizzle, here in Cambridge, just to the south of Cambridge, and they've poached a lot of top talent from the university to go and work in Altos Labs, whose mission is cellular rejuvenation. So vast amounts of investment are going into this, and talent, as I say, including Cambridge talent being poached to go to Altos and so on. And young, scientists are being inspired to join this field, which was once taboo. And we can't underestimate just how many more talented young people there are now, right? 100 years ago, there were only 1 billion people, and very few went to university. Now there are 8 billion people on the planet, and vastly more are going to university. Like, the sheer number of scientists now is so much more than at any point in history, and many more of them are being drawn to this field. And they have much better resources at their disposal. Technology does not advance. If we go back to the mastery of fire a million years ago, technology does not advance in a linear way. It's not sort of, we see 3 inventions a year. It advances in an exponential way, because every time I don't know if any of you have played the game Civilization, but it's like, if you do, you invent a thing, and that opens up a sort of branching network of new things you can invent. In other words, every technology allows the creation of many more technologies, and so technological progress is exponential. We saw that in the Industrial Revolution, which saw more technological progress than all of human history, even though all of human history is full of wonders. And we're seeing it now with the digital revolution. So this is particularly true of so-called general-purpose technologies, like obviously steam and electrification and an internal combustion engine, but then more recently the internet, for example, which changed everything. And now AI. Artificial intelligence. And AI is already transforming every area of scientific research and technological development, and accelerating those significantly. And AI is, in a sense, the ultimate general-purpose technology, because it can help take over from us or accelerate and augment us in almost any field. And we're already starting to see that. I'm sure many of you will know Demis Hassabis, Cambridge alum, who, as well as developing AlphaGo, which beat the world Go champion, took the world by great surprise in 2016, then went on to build AlphaFold to decipher proteins, for which he won the Nobel Prize recently, which is making an enormous difference already to the work of biologists. And that's just one example. So we can expect to see all of this progress, which is already happening, being enormously accelerated by these new tools, of which AI is just one. So that's the case for. As I say, we really do have proof of concepts that we're understanding aging better and are able to intervene in it to an extent in humans, but very significantly in other organisms. And in addition to that, we are now, and partly because of that, in fact, we are seeing vastly more money, talent, and new technologies go into the field. All right, so now I'm going to ask you, so what do I think? I don't know. Well, so who's right? Glass half empty or glass full? I don't know. So I'm going to ask you what you think. So I'm going to ask you to vote. In just a second, hang on, I'll explain the 3 options I'm going to ask you to vote on. So first of all, glass half full, you're convinced we are in a special age, something's about to happen, we're starting to see it already, and it's about to just, if the exponential curve goes like this, we're not up here at the top, we're just at this little bit here, the elbow, where it's about to shoot up, okay? That's if you think that one, so I'll ask you in a second. Or maybe, you're not sure. You get that this is a fantastic time of technological wonder, and we are making progress, but at the same time, we have heard it all before, and aging's incredibly complicated, so you think maybe 50-50. Or the final option, is, you're fed up with this charlatanism and snake oil and these false hopes. And, humans have a long history of denying death, and this is just the latest example. So you put the probability at less than 10%. Right, I'm going to ask you, so I am genuinely interested, so I am going to ask you, if you can stick up your hands, who thinks there's a more than 90% chance? I think it's really pretty likely we're going to see significant breakthroughs. Good, thank you. Please keep your hands up. So by significant breakthroughs, let's say that 30% we've seen in other mammals. 20. I'd say 20. Thank you very much. Good. Okay, who's open? Who thinks maybe we're on the verge of a breakthrough, but we've heard it all before as well. And okay, thank you. And okay, 30. I'll say about 30. Good. And who thinks this is all nonsense? Who? Thank you. 1, 2, 3. 13. Good. Well, I'm going to right. I'm making that. So that was 20, 30, and about 13. Good. Thank you. So I find that extremely interesting. I'm also in the bet hedging 50-50 camp at the moment. So I have long been a skeptic. Like a lot of my work on life extension and mortality and immortality and so on has been, this is a book I wrote, has been poo-pooing these arguments. So in this book, which came out in 2012, I argue that the fear of death is one of the main motivators in the development of civilization, and we develop all kinds of stories to help us manage that fear of death. Religions, obviously, but in lots of others too, including the belief in an elixir of life. So I have long been a skeptic. But that skepticism about living forever, and the question I asked was about a breakthrough in life extension of maybe around 30 years. And although I was very skeptical of that about 15 years ago when I was writing that book, I have started to shift my opinion, and I do now, I'm certainly open to the possibility that there might be a significant breakthrough, by which I mean something like that 30% that we've seen in other mammals. That would make average life expectancy in this country around 105, with significant numbers living into 110s, 120 and beyond. Oldest person ever to have lived, 122. We would see that record broken, maybe people living into the 130s. I don't think it's inevitable. I'm wary of the hype, but we're seeing interesting things happen. So I am open to the possibility. Well, I find it really interesting that we had a significant number of people, 20 out of however many, sort of 70 or so in this room, who thought it was very likely we're going to see this breakthrough. And almost a majority, about half the people here, who think it's 50-50, that we will see a significant breakthrough. Okay, now I want to spend the rest of the talk thinking about what that means. And what I want to try to convince you in the last few minutes is that this is huge, and we are completely unprepared. Okay, so what do I mean by that? I'm going to talk about a few issues. So this is another book I wrote much more recently, it came out in 2023, in which I explore some of the issues I'm going to talk about in a bit more depth. This was a debate with the wonderful philosopher John Martin Fisher. And Lord Martin Rees of this parish kindly wrote a foreword. But this is unpacking what some of the consequences of living forever in this world would be. So I'm going to talk a bit about some of those. So the first one that most people think about when we talk about living longer is overpopulation, very understandably. If it was immortality, then of course if people are not dying but they're still being born, obviously we'll have an overpopulation crisis. The world will just keep filling up. Now, we're not talking about people not dying, we're talking about people dying later. Well, what difference does that make? It means there'll be a population boom. So, and then the population will stabilize. So you could think of it as, say we managed to extend everyone's lives by 30 years. So all the people who are about to die, they get an extra 30 years, but then they do die. So we have 30 years in which more people are being born, but no one's dying. And then people start to die off. So we have a period of boom and then a plateau. Or another way to think of it would be we'd have more generations alive at any one time. So if we think of the average family in this country might have 3 generations, then if you add 30 years to life, it would be a fourth. So if we have 8 billion people alive today, then we'll instead have 11 or 12 billion people alive. So even though people are still dying, there will be a population boom before things plateau again. Well, what are the consequences of that? Well, that depends on what's called the carrying capacity of the planet. So how many people the planet can sustain. And the carrying capacity of the planet is relative to technological advance. So I mentioned earlier that 100 years ago there were 1 billion people on this planet. Also, famine and starvation were fairly widespread, not as much as they were 100 years before that or so on. I mean, if we go back a couple of thousand years, then we have only a tenth of the people who were, or fewer, 1% of the people who are alive today were alive, and yet starvation was even more common. Today we have 8 billion people alive, and famine and starvation have never been more infrequent. So as well as thinking about this, we have vastly increased the carrying capacity of the planet due to technological advance, things like nitrogen fixation and the agricultural revolution and so on. So the optimists say, well, it's fine, we'll just keep doing that. We'll keep working out how to get more out of the earth so that we can sustain ever more people. Well, some of you might be optimistic about that too, and certainly we will see, I'm sure, technological wonders that allow us to do that. But at the same time, I'm sure you're also well aware of the toll that we're taking already on the planet. We're still dealing, of course, with the consequences of the Industrial Revolution in the form of climate change. There's a massive biodiversity crisis, of course, as we eat up all of the world's land for agriculture and so on. So it looks like we've got 8 billion people and we're keeping them alive very well. But, many people would argue that, no, we're destroying the planet. This is terrible. This is just a slow death. So we've already exceeded the carrying capacity. So it really isn't at all clear that we could sustain the massive boost in population that would come from living longer. At least we would have to become much more sustainable in how we live. Okay, the next point. Again, one that people often think of, and that's my overpopulation picture, is an increase in inequality. So I don't know if any of you have seen this very mediocre film with Justin Timberlake called In Time. It was a sort of blockbuster. But anyway, it's an interesting film, nonetheless. It has an interesting premise. So it's a film in which time is literally money, that minutes are the currency which people exchange. So people are genetically engineered to stop aging at the age of 25, and they're given a kind of clock which determines when they will die, and they can sort of buy more time effectively. And some people, like Justin Timberlake's character, just live day to day. They go to work and earn just enough to make it through the night until they get to work the next day. And others are so super wealthy they're effectively immortal. And needless to say, the film is about how unjust all of this is. And yet many people believe it would be an accurate portrayal of what a world with radical life extension would be like. I mean, we don't know what these interventions would be like. Maybe it would be a tablet as freely available as aspirin. But there's a good chance that it won't be, that it will be a whole series of elaborate interventions that require expensive and regular trips to clinics and so on, and would be the preserve only of the wealthy or the super wealthy. Well, normally we consider massive gaps in life expectancy to be unjust. I mean, in this country, they're reported with some regularity, difference between North and South, different ethnic groups, different classes, and so on. And those are differences of a few years, and we consider them unjust. Something must be done. Well, imagine if those were differences of decades instead. But not only could those discrepancies be intrinsically unjust, but they could exacerbate further injustice. In capitalism, those who have accumulate more, right? That's how capitalism works. If you've got capital, it's working for you, getting rent or whatever, dividends. So the rich get richer. Now imagine those rich are also very, very long-lived. Or imagine that they're hogging the best positions, that they're sort of, sitting on Cambridge professorships and so on. I don't know, what are the young going to do? All of a sort of envious young, waiting for dead men's boots, so they can move on. And, some of you will have heard reported that recently when Vladimir Putin went to China, talked to Xi Jinping on the anniversary of the Second World War and various others, they were overheard talking about the prospect of immortality and how 70 is now just a child, and you can use organ transplants to become, in their words, Putin's words, younger and younger. Well, I'll let you make up your own minds about the desirability of a world with an immortal Vladimir Putin. But I think this gives us a bit of a dilemma, because we could say, okay, what we need to tackle injustice is to make sure these advances in healthcare and longevity are available to everyone. But of course, if we do that, then we have the overpopulation problem. So we have this double bind. And the final point I want to make is about meaning in life. What would it be like for each of us personally to live that long? So philosophers and artists have long speculated about this, and they tend to be on the sort of glass half empty side of things. Bernard Williams, a great philosopher of this parish, wrote in 1973 a very influential essay called The Macropolis Affair, or The Macropolis Case. So the Macropolis Case, sometimes translated as The Macropolis Affair, is a play written by Karol Čapek that was then made into an opera. The Macropolis Case, Reflections on the Tedium of Immortality, was Bernard Williams' take on this. So in the play itself is about a woman who seems to be a young woman, a young opera singer. And it turns out, spoiler alert, it turns out that her father was a physician to some court, can't remember which, and invented an elixir of life, and she took the recipe and has been living out her life under various guises of various names, always as a singer. But now she's sort of cold, bored, tired of life, and she needs to renew the elixir again. She's sort of take it again. She's lost the recipe. She finds it, but in the end, she decides to destroy it rather than take it again. So it's about, as I say, the tedium of immortality. And this is a beloved topic of philosophers and writers and so on. Okay, but we're not talking about forever. And I argue in that book I sort of flashed up earlier that genuine immortality would inevitably cause a breakdown in meaning, that we couldn't have anything like a human life over infinity. Okay, but we're not talking about infinity, we're 30 years, 30 years is a long way from infinity. So would we be able to sustain happiness, purpose and meaning with the kind of life extension I'm talking about? Well, let's leave the philosophers and the poets behind for a moment. Let's look at the facts. Here are some facts about boredom and meaninglessness. According to the World Health Organization, 5% of adults worldwide suffer from depression in their lifetimes. So around 280 million people. And the WHO say this is likely to be a significant underestimate because of there aren't reporting mechanisms in many parts of the world, and the stigma associated with mental health problems, and so on. So there's a Woody Allen joke, some of you probably know, where there's two old ladies in a canteen. And one says, "The food here is terrible." And the other one says, "I know, and the portions are so small." Exactly, right? So what do we want longer lives for, exactly? And, 700,000 people choose to end their lives. Right? So this is a terrible and tragic fact that, and with these levels of depression, it shows that already clearly we're not delivering long, 80-year lives of happiness and purpose. Well, you might be thinking that, these kinds of rates of depression and so on are highest in countries where life's tough and grueling and people have to, slave away for their next meal, and they've got no clean drinking water, and they have to, walk 10 miles to the river, and they've got no prospects of ever improving their lot. No. It's not those places where depression and suicide are highest. It's countries like ours. There is now, it's well established that countries becoming richer does not make people happier. And indeed, there are some, the correlations, obviously there's complexity in the detail and so on, but there are some negative correlations. So, for example, the 20 countries with the highest proportions of people who say they have no purpose in life are all relatively or highly industrialized, with the Netherlands at number 1. 27% of Dutch people say they have no purpose in their lives. So one psychologist called this affluenza, that kind of this woes of the affluent. And you can see it go back a couple of hundred years ago, this idea of the sort of the aristocrat with ennui, who's sort of terribly bored. And we still have that with us. Industrialization, modernization, the processes that have delivered us prosperity and long lives have also destroyed old ways of life that gave meaning and purpose and structure. The rituals that bound us to the land and to the seasons and to each other. If you go to indigenous communities that still maintain something like their traditional hunter-gatherer ways of life, life is short, it's tough. Average life expectancy is 32, infant mortality is high, but the people there are happy and full of meaning into old age. Everyone has a role in society well into old age, and they're myths that tie them to the cosmos and to the land and so on are unbroken. And we've lost a lot of that. Last year there was a study done in Harvard that found that more than half of young American adults say they experience no purpose in their life and that this is negatively influencing their mental health. One said, "I have no purpose or meaning in life. I just go to work, do my mundane job, go home, prepare for the next day, scroll on my phone and repeat." Work, scroll, repeat. Is that what we want more of? Is that what we want? Another 30 years of work, scroll, repeat? Does it matter if we have 80 years of that or 90 or 100? So the techno-scientific worldview that's delivering this progress seems to be at the same time robbing us of the ability to enjoy it. So that's the bad news. Here's some good news. A little bit of good news-ish. Meaninglessness is not evenly distributed in society. Meaningfulness, purpose in life, is not evenly distributed in society. Religious people, for example, tend to have higher senses of meaning and purpose. I'm not a religious person, and so I in many ways envy that sense of place in the cosmos that mythologies and traditional belief system and religions can give. And while it's true that on average wealthier countries are not happier and have a stronger sense of meaning, there is diversity within that. Wealthier people in those countries do have higher life satisfaction and higher sense of meaning. It's mostly the poor and elderly in wealthy countries who self-report as having the least purpose and being the least happy. So one demographer said, in demographic terms, the most likely person in the world to feel that life is without purpose is an older person, not personally wealthy, in a wealthy country. So there's a lot we're getting wrong about managing the long lives that we already have. But at the same time, we need to try to take hope from the fact that there are people, hopefully everyone in this room, who are leading happy lives of meaning and purpose. So, just to sum up, my main message to you today is we might be on the verge of a breakthrough in life extension technology. I don't know, but we might be. And certainly I've adjusted my probabilities to something like 50-50, if by significant breakthrough we mean something like those 30 years. And we are completely unprepared for this. From a policymaker's point of view, I spent 10 years in Whitehall a long time ago. From a policymaker's point of view, if there's a 50-50 chance of something so profound happening, we ought to be paying a lot more attention than we are. Obviously our pensions aren't prepared for this and retirement schemes. Our education system, are we going to educate people when they're kids and hope that education is going to last for 100 years in a time of incredibly rapid social and technological transformation? Of course it isn't. It's going to change nuclear families. I mean, we've already seen that shift with more people living longer. It's going to change how we think about jobs and careers. Again, some of that's already happening. It's going to change our relationship with the natural world, of course. So we will need to think much more seriously than we do now about managing injustice, becoming more sustainable, and perhaps most profoundly, how we can better distribute meaning and purpose in our societies. So just to finish with a sort of optimistic note, if you like, I'm in no rush. I hope that 2056 isn't really my date. I love life and I'm curious. I want to see what the world looks like. I'm in 2100. That would make me sort of an implausible 127. I love this era of wonders in which we live, and I've got 3 children. I want to see them have grandchildren, and so on. So I don't want to leave you only with a pessimistic note. I'm optimistic about technological progress and our ability to manage it. But what I want to convey to you is that we need really to be imaginative and bold in thinking about how we can make this revolution, if it happens, which it might, go well, so we can live, sustainably and justly longer lives of purpose and meaning. Thank you.
Questions?
John Sprigg, Trinity. Thank you very much, Professor, for a fascinating talk. There's one question I have. You said that starvation is much less common now than it was. And it's certainly true in the early ages that starvation did kill people. But starvation on 1 billion, which is the population 100 years ago, is likely to kill far less than people dying of starvation in the Sahel in Sudan, where the starvation hasn't ceased since Band-Aid, in a population of 8 billion.
Yeah, no, thank you for that. And I don't want to play down in any way the suffering that we have around the world at the moment. And one of the great outrages that we live with is how unevenly distributed the benefits of the prosperity that we enjoy are. There's so much still to be done. In the lives that we have now, sort of the 80 years that we have and the prosperity that we have, there's so much more to be done in tackling poverty and disease and lives cut short in areas exactly like the one you imagine. And it's important that we have that in mind when thinking about the future as well. But somehow we have to have all of these things in our minds in order to make wise decisions. Now, I spend a lot of time with techno-optimists who are incredibly excited. Well, Demis Hassabis, right? Demis is a fantastic guy. I've got a lot of time for Demis, his vision is driving some of the wonders that are defining this age and will help with technology. And he says things like, soon AI will solve climate change and solve this, solve aging, and solve that. And we need that kind of optimism in order to drive the technology forwards. But I'm reading another book at the moment that's just come out about aging by a physician called Eric Topol. It's a very good book, I recommend it. And he says that 50 years ago, when he started out as a cardiologist, people said he was a fool. We don't need cardiologists. Statins had just been discovered. We understood what kind of lifestyle factors caused heart disease. We were able to make it a thing of the past. It was 50 years ago. Heart disease is still the #1 killer. Well, why is that? Because of infrastructural reasons, like these sort of huge legacies of social injustice that shape our world. It turns out to be really hard to solve things like, unhealthy diets in communities in the US where there are no grocery stores, and this kind of thing. And of course around the world too. So we do live in an age of technological wonders, and we should be optimistic. But at the same time, we need to, of course, recognize exactly these tragedies that are unfolding and the incredibly complex sort of social, economic, political, geographical and ecological infrastructures that underlie these, that will make it hard in practice to translate a lot of these benefits beyond, a lucky minority.
Professor Cave, thank you very much. I found your lecture absolutely riveting. I'm most grateful. Given these discoveries logically lead to, if they come about, logically lead to an increased population, if you carry that forward to an ever-increasing population, you're then likely to get pressure for reducing births. Otherwise, the situation becomes impossible. Now, we've seen that for other reasons tried in China. But how do you see that working out on a worldwide scale?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. So the optimists point to a number of factors in thinking about managing increasing population. One is, colonizing other planets. And some of the same people who are investing in life extension technologies are investing also in space travel. So that's their plan B. So Jeff Bezos, for example, of course, Elon Musk. It's worth remembering, I mean, you didn't raise this, but it's just worth remembering that the most inhospitable parts of this planet, so, you know, the top of Mount Everest, the bottom of the ocean and so on, are vastly more hospitable than anywhere else in the solar system. So, vastly more, right? So, you know, if there's a reason that we don't have cities on the tops of the Himalayas or at the bottom of the ocean, then, you know, 100-fold why we shouldn't on Mars. So that's not going to get us out of the fix. But the other thing they point to is, of course, reduced population, reduced birth rates, whether that's enforced or not. And I mean, so the optimists, as a rule, do not like to point to the idea of enforcing reduced fertility, because, you know, they tend to be libertarians. They have, you know, a deep belief in personal freedom, and you could hardly get a worse intervention in personal freedom than restricting reproduction. We recognize it today as a fundamental human right. You know, for many people, not all, of course, but for many, having children is an enormous part of what gives life meaning. So that's true for me. And if you think about what it would mean to enforce a policy of restricted birth, so, you know, compulsory sterilization or potentially infanticide and abortion and so on, like, this is a profoundly dystopian world. So the optimists try to steer away from that and say, well, birth rates are naturally falling. It's a very clear trend that the higher the survival rates of individuals and their children, the lower the number of children that they have. And this hasn't even stabilized at a replacement level, which is 2 or just over 2 if you account for accident and death by accident. That's like 2.1, for example, in the US. But it hasn't even stabilized there, and in many countries has dropped below, as I'm sure you know. So many countries in Eastern Europe and East Asia, fertility rates are now below replacement level. So optimists about life extension point to that and say we don't need to worry because population growth is naturally slowing down. Now, in reality, what it will mean, and actually there are people, you know, including these techno-utopians like Elon Musk, saying, God, we need to have more children. And, you know, there are some sinister racist undertones under some of those views, because actually there are some parts of the world that are still having plenty of children. But, anyway, but the consequences of life extension and reduced fertility are also difficult to manage and require a lot of thought. So at the moment, there are still lots of babies being born, you know, on average around the world, even though it varies from like 5 per woman in Namibia through to, you know, 1 in Korea and so on. And so if we suddenly fixed life extension today and got those extra 30 years, we would see this population boom that I talked about. So we would see, you know, a population rocket from, say, 8 billion to 12 billion. But then because fewer babies were being born, and if we see it decrease even more, as some suggest, we would see a decline from that. So we'd see a population boom, then a population collapse. Now that's extremely difficult to manage in terms of our relationship to the natural world and our economies and so on. So if you think of Japan, which enjoyed a massive boom, then a population collapse, you know, so vast amounts of the natural world have to be sort of paved over or turned to agriculture. Species go extinct, you can't bring them back. Then population collapses and the economy goes into decline. So that might be, well, yeah, again, it's my job to be the worrywart, right? I'm an ethicist. I'm a technology ethicist. It's what I do. But I'm I will point to the fact that declining populations or restricting population wouldn't be a panacea, but introduces new complexities.
Thanks for your talk. I work as a psychotherapist, so I spend a lot of time listening to people about their fears and denials around death. And I'm curious, is there any evidence that attitudes to death have any impact on longevity?
Oh, that's interesting. I do not know of any. Attitudes to death have an impact on longevity? No, that's very interesting. Not that I'm aware of. No, I mean, so I've tapped a lot into area of social psychology called terror management theory. I don't know if you heard of it. It was developed from Otto Rank, who was himself a student of Freud and so on. But these are doing empirical work, and they demonstrate how a lot of our belief systems are tailored to manage the fear of death. And they look at a lot of different kinds of belief systems, including religious belief systems, obviously, but also sort of belief in the efficacy of science and technology, the pursuit of fame, and having children, and so on. But I guess other than in very extreme cases where people are willing to sacrifice their lives because of their immortality views, so, you know, certain kinds of jihadists, for example, who genuinely believe that they will go straight to heaven if they, you know, commit a certain act, sacrifice themselves. I think apart from that, I'm not aware of any.
Thank you again for a great talk. I just wanted to mention the so-called transhumanists who imagine that they can achieve immortality by leaving their bodies altogether and having their minds reinstantiated in some sort of computerized silicon environment. I think there are severe philosophical problems with that. Would you agree?
Yes, I completely. The end. No. I am extremely skeptical of this. I write about it a little bit in the immortality book I showed earlier. But I mean, so mind uploading, for those of you who don't know, is the idea that we can just like somehow upload our minds onto some, you know, digital entity, a computer, the internet, a robot, whatever, and so live on. And silicon promises to be much more sustainable, repairable than our, you know, messy biological bodies which fall apart. That's the dream. But I think it's madness. And I mean, not just feasible practically, but philosophically, I don't think it makes any sense. I mean, if I said to you all, well, I've done it. There was a scanner in the door. See that? It looks like it just closes the door, but actually it's a scanner. And I've scanned all your brains, and on the moon, on my special immortality factory, I have already recreated 10 of each of you. And now I'm going to kill you all. But don't worry, because you're all living on the moon already. Right? You'd think I was a lunatic. So yes, I think there are some deep worries.